Greetings, all! Let's pick up from where we left off last time with the V.T.P. and take a trip to Generation 2 today.
Generation 2 was oddly enough meant to be the end of the franchise originally, and it is quite clear this was the case as the developers of the games went all out with it, heavily changing and expanding upon the foundation that had been placed from the first generation, seeking to make the experience as grand and powerful as possible as a proper send-off. While we all know now that this would not be the end of the franchise, it still proved to be a wonderful experience as trainers got the chance to travel through the Johto region to try and once again become the champion of this new region and stop Team Rocket once and for all in their endeavors. The generation saw the release of many new factors, Pokémon evolutions, and so many other attributes that were going to become series staples in their own right. The games in this generation pushing the limits of what the Game Boy Color could really show off, and thus served as the ultimate adventure for old-time fans to enjoy to its absolute finest. Time Capsule. The Time Capsule served as the first way in which players could actually trade Pokémon not just between games in the same generation, but more importantly, between generations. This was made in the time of Generation 2, which existed 3 years into the future from the events of the Generation 1 games, and is an invention crafted by Bill, the creator of the original Pokémon PC system. In essence, it would allow players to transfer Pokémon from these generations between themselves, although there are a few stipulations. This mainly came down to the fact that Generation 2 Pokémon could not normally be transferred into Generation 1 games, and any that were transferred to Generation 1 could not have any new moves that are not a part of the original generation. While this did severely limit the type of Pokémon that were compatible with the system, it was also the only way to get Pokémon like the legendary birds, fossil Pokémon, Kanto starters and more into Generation 2, and thus served as a vital tool for players trying to complete the Generation 2 Pokédex. However, the hardware split that occurred between Generations 2 and 3 resulted in a change that saw the rise of remakes, and given that time was no longer an issue in that sense, the Time Capsule was no longer needed and was left as a reminder of how trading has evolved between generations within the mainline series. Multiple regions. One feature that really sets Generation 2 apart from all others is the fact that it contains not one, but 2 entire regions for you to explore. The main campaign of the game starts you off in the Johto region, but once you defeat the champion Lance, you have the chance to travel to the Kanto region to continue your quest, though in the original Generation 2 games, it's a scaled down version as a result of hardware limitations on the amount of information that could be stored on the cartridges. This has been the hallmark and perhaps most appealing aspect of the Generation 2 games, but it is also something that never made a comeback outside of Fire Red and Leaf Green and the Generation 2 remakes for a reason. Gold, Silver, and Crystal were meant to be the last games in the entire series, so the limits of the hardware available were pushed to the limit in order to make it a truly grand finale to the beloved series. However, as we all know today, and as already stated, the insane popularity of the games meant that the franchise was too lucrative to simply end there, resulting in the creation of Ruby and Sapphire, and the rest is pretty much history. What was once meant to be the end merely became another story in this franchise, and given how much more has been given since, I think it's a gimmick that the franchise is okay with not repeating into the foreseeable future. Mystery Type. The Mystery Type is a unique type that was never really used for combat directly, and its existence was a bit of an oddity for several generations after debuting. This type was originally used to classify the Curse technique when it was introduced in Generation 2, and was created because the move itself is unique in that it has a different effect on the user depending upon what type they are. When used by a Pokémon that isn't a Ghost type, the move would raise the attack and defense stats of the user while lowering their speed stat. If used by a Ghost type, however, it instead places a curse on the target that reduces their HP by 25% of its maximum value at the end of every turn they are still out in the field, in exchange for 50% of the user's HP. Because of this change in effect depending upon the type of the user, the Mystery Type was created in order to classify it in the programming. The type itself has no weaknesses and resistances because the data was never meant to be included in combat, though these attributes were added so hacking the type into play wouldn't damage the games it was a part of. The type did not last long, however, as in Generation 5 the type was removed altogether as the Curse technique was classified as a Ghost type move, thus eliminating the need for it entirely. Pokegear. The Pokegear was a device in Generation 2 that helped to give an air of advancing tech in that it provided a number of services and functions that, though simple today, really stood out and helped to make it an invaluable tool for players. For one thing, it displayed the time of the in-game clock in the game, which tied in well with the debut of time-based events in this generation. Second, it provided access to a map screen, which could be more useful than just pulling out a map like in the original games, so that was a decent addition. Thirdly, it could actually allow players to call people like family and other trainers, and this action was actually quite lovely. not only would it allow players to decide from afar whether they wanted a cut of cash earned from beating trainers to go home to their mother, or even call to get their Pokédex checked, but they could register the number of certain trainers and actually fight them again and again for extra money and experience. Some would even occasionally come across rare items, and in Crystal especially, this proved invaluable for getting access to evolutionary stones, which were otherwise incredibly hard to get a hold of in normal gameplay. Lastly, the device had a radio function that could allow players to tune into special shows and music for either a nice listening experience or some other function, and it proved to be incredibly useful for getting Pokemon like Snorlax to move out of the way. With all this said though, the device didn't really make it outside of Generation 2 in its remakes, but that is only because it was eventually replaced with a Pokénav, still serving as the original multi-purpose device that would later spawn much more versatile communication systems in the future. Sequel games. As mentioned before, Generation 2 was meant to be the very last of the franchise, and given that its associated games were meant to remake this series as a whole with their inclusion of both the Johto and Kanto regions, the games themselves were meant to be sequel games to the Generation 1 games. By this, I mean literally just that. The games took place in the same timeline, but 3 years into the future compared to the original games. This meant that the events of the first games were not only canon, but more importantly, gave players the chance to interact with the characters from the original games, especially when they managed to beat the champion of the Johto region and earn a trip to the Kanto region in return. As a result of this, many of the same assets that were in the original games were used in new ways within Gold, Silver, and Crystal and the remakes, and the final battle of the entire adventure culminated with a fight with Red, the original protagonist of the Generation 1 games. While this helped to tie everything together with a nice bow, as it was intended to, the extreme hype and profitability of the franchise meant that future games were just too good of an idea to ever pass up, and thus the idea of each and every game in a series being a sequel to something else in the franchise was dropped out of the spotlight. This trend would be reproduced with Pokemon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness, as well as the Generation 5 games, but was dropped as the focal point of the in-game story afterwards to allow for greater versatility and the way that the stories of the games were designed, even if they do still fit in an overall timeline of events now, with recurring characters and subsequent generations. Pokérus. Pokérus is an extremely rare virus that is almost unseen by players in most playthroughs, but is a welcome sight to many, as while the chances of a Pokemon contracting it are incredibly low, lower than even finding a shiny Pokemon at full odds, and actually has the positive benefit of permanently doubling the EVs and stat experience that a Pokemon earns by beating opponents in battle. Moreover, the infection lasts between 1 to 4 days for a Pokemon in a player's party, and can be spread to other party members, thus allowing for the effects to be replicated onto other Pokemon readily. The positive effects of this virus will remain on a Pokemon even after they are naturally cured of this presence, and given that it has no drawbacks, it makes sense that this, combined with its rarity, gives little reason to be removed, and the virus has thus remained a part of the franchise since its debut in Generation 2. Female player character. While it might seem like the option to play as a female character is a no-brainer when it comes to the creation of player characters in Pokemon, the games weren't really designed with the thought of female players and their representation in mind initially, as the entirety of Generation 1 and most of Generation 2 saw only male characters made available as an option for people to play the games with. It wasn't until Crystal that, as one might guess, the player character Chris was made available to play as. This actually had a notable impact in Crystal, as the dialogue used by certain characters would change depending upon the sex of the player character, and while the aspect has not really been repeated to a large degree, the ability for players to either be a boy or girl in the games is such a natural aspect of any RPG video game today that it's little wonder why the features remained a crucial component of the games ever since. Time-based events. Generation 2 saw the inclusion of new hardware into the cartridges of its associated games that allowed for the accurate telling of time beyond just gameplay time. Set at the very beginning of the games, the Johto region allowed players to explore land where not only the time of day affected the types of events and Pokemon that could be found in certain locations, but also kept track of the days of the week for other events tied to this cycle. While it might not seem like a big deal at first, not all games replicated this feature afterwards, even if time was a factor that could be shown through the changing of the aesthetics of the outdoors. Today, however, such time-based events are crucial for attributes like berry growing and providing greater diversity to the type of Pokemon found in the wild, and given that it further helps players immerse themselves even further into the game world, it makes sense why it is a feature that has mostly stayed in place through subsequent games and generations. Battle Tower. The Battle Tower was introduced in Pokemon Crystal as a way of pushing players to really make the strongest Pokemon they possibly could through any means necessary. In essence, the Battle Tower challenge has mostly been the same and has not changed all that much over time, even though it has taken on different names in different generations. Players are allowed to take 3 Pokémon of their choosing in level and use them to fight against NPC opponents that also have 3 Pokémon, with the obvious goal being to defeat the opponent without losing all of one's Pokémon. Healing items are not allowed, but players have their Pokémon fully healed at the end of every battle, with them typically having to complete 7 battles in a row in order to acquire some sort of reward for their efforts. The reward itself originally just being expensive items, but later converted into BP for buying rare items. The battle tower itself may be simplistic in design, but it is the level of challenge that it brings to players that helps it to really stand out and forces players to make the most of the time they have to craft the best team they can possibly get to the top. Breeding in Generation 2 helped to make this more than a reality for many, and given that it incentivized players to really think hard about the types of Pokémon they would like to use to complete these challenges, and not just their favorites, its inclusion in some form or another in every subsequent generation more than demonstrates its popularity amongst players and developers alike. Move Tutors, Deleters, and Relearners. Starting with the Move Tutor, this trio of special NPCs quickly became staples in the series for the long haul because of their simple but otherwise vital services. Move Tutors are used in-game in order to teach special moves to Pokémon that might not be able to learn them naturally otherwise, oftentimes for a small fee, and thus help to radically diversify the moves that Pokémon can have access to in a fight. Move Deleters, much as the name suggests, are people that can help Pokémon forget a move in order to open up a slot in the move repertoire. This came mainly in handy in early generations for the removal of HM moves, which otherwise could not be removed from a Pokémon's moveset in any other way. Lastly, the move Relearner allows Pokémon to remember a move that it might have had at one time, but otherwise forgot, either via leveling up, or even via artificial methods such as through TMs, HMs, and TRs. This too used to work at a small fee, though today this and other services are mainly free. Together the trio helped to give players the chance to mix around and adapt the movesets of their Pokémon to fit a variety of challenges, and their services themselves are so vital to normal gameplay now that it is little wonder that their capacity for versatility has remained a staple for the series since they first debuted. Apricorns and new ball types. While players were rather limited in their selection of different ball types within Generation 1, Generation 2 introduced entirely new types of balls in the form of the Apricorn balls. While the devices themselves were a pain to have made, as initially they could only be made one at a time, and it wasn't until Crystal that multiples of the same type could be made with Apricorns, they offered a new window into the creation of ball types that had unique effects compared to the standard capture devices that were available to buy at most Pokemarts, among other sources. This concept, though a bit frustrating in Gold, Silver, and Crystal, helped pave the way for more ball types with unique effects to come onto the scene, with Generations 3 and 4 especially giving a lot of new ball types for players to experiment with in order to maximize the effectiveness of their efforts to hunt for Pokemon in the wild. Even though this process has mostly slowed down in recent generations, with fewer new ball types introduced, it has allowed for a level of strategy and engagement in hunting Pokemon to develop that simply didn't exist before, and thus has become a crucial aspect of the monster catching process in its entirety. Held items. Though seemingly ubiquitous these days, it wasn't until Generation 2 that Pokemon were given the capacity to actually hold items in and out of battle. Though this seems like a simple enough concept, the effects were incredibly impactful, as it meant that Pokemon no longer needed to rely solely on the moves, stats, and types in order to win battles. With the advent of held items, new strategies could be formed to give Pokemon a better chance of coming out on top in a fight, and the diverse list of items that could be held and the overall effects has become incredibly large and diverse over time. It is such an active part of combat now that many items can be the difference between victory and defeat, and work well in linking teammates together to diversify what they can do. As such, there has been little reason to ever remove this feature because of how much it contributes to both casual and competitive play with the series, even if rare exceptions do exist, such as the Pokemon Let's Go games. Mass outbreaks. While the appearance rate and locations of many Pokemon has typically stayed isolated to a single area with little difference aside from the time of day or the weather in rare cases, there are some Pokemon that are normally extremely hard to find or even non-existent in an area until they undergo what is known as a mass outbreak or swarm, which was introduced in Generation 2. Under normal circumstances, certain creatures can be extremely hard to find on their own, but when a swarm or mass outbreak of them occurs in an area, they appear in much higher concentrations than normal, giving players a much greater chance of actually finding and acquiring one for their collection. While the triggers for these outbreaks are different depending upon what games they appear in, they offer a bit of intrigue to the games that they take part in, and give players an incentive to play the games more often in the hopes of seeing one of these outbreaks happen, and thus helps to provide more content for them to engage with, extending the overall longevity and value in the long run. Legendaries in the main story. While this attribute would be much more prominent starting in Generation 3, with villainous organizations taking a role and trying to use the power of legendary Pokémon to reach a specific objective or deed, it was in Pokémon Crystal where the concept of legendary Pokémon taking a prominent role in the story of a game was actually introduced, as Suicune played a part of the progress in the main story, even if it wasn't necessarily a huge part of the main campaign originally. Legendary Pokémon have of course existed since the very beginning of the series, but they were usually optional and out of the way for many at first, and thus required notable exploration in order to locate and fight. However, Suicune and Crystal made it possible for the stories to be centered at least partially around the importance of these beasts in the lore of the region and how they connected with the overall player journey through the main campaign. This served to elevate the status of legendaries from just powerful Pokémon to important figures in the mythology of many of the regions that have come into existence in subsequent games. No longer were they just related to being part of the catching and collecting of Pokémon, but now they had a role in the way that a region and its lore was built, and how the people of those lands had developed and thrived in their presence. Moreover, this also allowed legendaries themselves to take on much greater roles in the canon of the game world, effectively creating the class of legendaries I refer to as deity-class legendaries, beasts whose existence has helped to shape the world as we see it, and whose power is able to destroy all that oppose them. Though Suicune's role in all this may have been on a much smaller scale at first, and nonetheless set the stage for making the Pokémon world a far vaster and more exciting one, where gods and mortals could interact and work with each other, and I dare say that this sort of dynamic, and the series as a whole, would not be the same without this change in the role of legendary Pokémon. In-game special events. Normally, legendary and even some mythical Pokémon are encountered and captured much the same way as most Pokémon are, but every once in a while, Pokémon might be encountered as a consequence of special in-game events. These events are usually programmed directly into a game to be possible to trigger, but are normally inaccessible unless some sort of special item is distributed to unlock that event and thus enable the acquisition of a special Pokémon, either through battle or as a gift. This started in Pokémon Crystal with the creation of the GS Ball, a special key item that was only released over in Japan originally. When taken to Kurt in Azalea Town, and then the Shrine in Ilex Forest, this would trigger an encounter that could allow players to try and catch a level 30 Celebi, which was otherwise impossible to obtain through normal gameplay. This helped to make the games last longer by giving players an incentive to wait for certain events and mobilize around them to make rare Pokémon in the games actually accessible, and given this became the standard afterwards past Generation 2, it's safe to say that Celebi and its encounter helped to define how mythical Pokémon would be handled in the future, even if the quality and significance of these events has sadly degraded considerably over time. Special Split. In Generation 1, while most of the base stats for Pokémon made sense in their design and purpose, the special stat of that generation was a bit on the broken side, as it counted as both special attack and special defense for Pokémon. This essentially meant that any Pokémon with a high special stat was able to both fight with and resist special attacks to an immense degree, and it often made Psychic-type Pokémon an extreme pain to deal with, compounded by how broken the type was to begin with in the first generation. In order to balance everything out more, Generation 2 saw the special stat essentially get split to form special attack and special defense. With these new stats, there was a lot more balance and greater strategy to work with, as now Pokémon could be strong in using special attacks, and strong in being able to resist them, but the two were no longer linked to each other, so one did not necessarily impact the other directly. While this did have the effect of weakening many Pokémon that otherwise severely benefited from these two stats being merged as one, it also strengthened some, and in the long run, it is hard to imagine the games as they are without this change. Given that the attack and defense stats for physical moves already existed, it is still funny to see that the special stat was not given the same due course originally, thus making this change in Generation 2 fundamental and essential for making Pokémon battles fair and balanced at a base level. Dark and Steel types and changes to type effectiveness. It is easy to say that the metagame of Generation 1 was a bit of a nightmare for most to work with as a consequence of poor balancing between many types, with some, like the normal and psychic types, being fairly broken and hard for many to deal with, while other types like the bug and poison types were all but useless in serious combat. Generation 2 saw notable changes being made to how combat in the games worked, and aside from the split of the special stat into special attack and special defense, it also saw the introduction of two entirely new types that would serve to shake up competitive play immensely, the Dark and Steel types. Now, in their debut in Generation 2, these types really weren't worth a great deal offensively, but that really wasn't the point. The point was to use them to counter the prevalent normal and psychic-type Pokémon that otherwise tended to dominate parts of the existing metagame. The Dark type was meant to be a direct counter to the Psychic type in that it is completely immune to the type, and can deal super effective damage against both them and Ghost types, who otherwise could ignore the issues of most attacks being unable to severely harm them. The Steel type, on the other hand, was designed as a brutal counter to both the Psychic and Normal types by making it not only resistant to those types, but also many more, and became a hallmark for defensive combat, which helped to make Generation 2 the stall generation of the metagame. Both of these types do have their notable weaknesses, but they still help to balance the system out alongside other changes, namely making the Fire type resistant to the Ice type, making Psychic types actually weak to Ghost types, and changing the awkward weakness pairing that existed between the Bug and Poison types in Generation 1. Given that types like this are almost never pulled from the franchise, barring one major exception, it is no wonder that they are still a part of the series today and have become their own contentious types to deal with in both casual and competitive play. Breeding. One of the biggest issues that made the original Generation 1 games a pain to actually complete was the fact that if you obtained a Pokémon of a higher evolutionary state than the first stage of a family, there was no way to get the lower forms registered in your Pokédex. You needed to get the base form for all of them if you wanted to actually register the data for every member of an evolutionary family. As such, the majority of players likely never got to see that happen until the release of Pokémon Yellow, as the starter Pokémon in particular were notoriously hard to get data on as a consequence. However, this all changed in Generation 2 with the advent of breeding and making eggs. In essence, if two Pokémon of opposite genders that are part of the same egg group, or a Pokémon like a Ditto, are left in a special daycare, being located just outside Goldenrod City in the Johto region specifically, it is possible that they will leave an egg that can then be carried around over time in a player's party and hatched to produce the earliest stage of evolution of the mother Pokémon. This not only made it possible to actually complete the Pokédex with much greater ease, but also opened the pathway to mechanics like breeding for good DV and IV values, and even acquiring rare baby Pokémon that otherwise could not be obtained in the wild through any other means. This went even farther with the advent of egg moves, which are moves that, if possessed by the right members in that couple, can be passed directly down to the offspring so they have access to that move right away as they are born, severely changing the move pool potential for a lot of Pokémon. This process helped to not only show the way in which Pokémon actually reproduce in the games, but provided a valuable tool for exploiting the above-mentioned factors, and in turn has made itself a part of the franchise that almost all future games would feature and incorporate into the operations, and it is doubtful that the function will ever be left out of any future installments. Shiny Pokémon. While they technically did exist in Generation 1 based on the original determining factors, the advent and prominent use of color as part of the Generation 2 games with the Game Boy Color was taken advantage of by Game Freak in order to craft what has become one of the most defining and characteristic aspects of the entire Pokémon franchise: Shiny Pokémon. Put simply, Shiny Pokémon are specimens that have a notably different body color compared to their normal form, and tend to have a special sparkle animation attached to them that will go off as they are located and used in battle. While these Pokémon do not have enhanced stats or anything else that makes them better than normal Pokémon, they have always been incredibly rare, with the original encounter odds being less than 1 in 8,000 chance in the wild. Originally, this factor was actually tied to the DV values of a Pokémon, and thus could only be found among certain specimens with the correct combination of DV values. But the advent of the revamped stat system established in Generation 3 isolated the shiny factor to its own counter, and thus allowed players to acquire shiny Pokémon that could actually be used in competitive play. Over time, many different methods have been introduced for acquiring these sparkly specimens, and each generation, minus Generation 3, has featured a way to have better chances at getting one. Generation 8 even expanded upon this with the creation of Square Shinies or Ultra Shinies, which are 16 times rarer than a standard shiny Pokémon and are marked by the square sparkle marks given off when they appear in battle, in contrast to the normal spark-like sparkle seen otherwise. While they might not always be better than standard Pokémon, shiny Pokémon have been a huge part of the franchise since their debut because they give players something really, truly special to hunt for and to have bragging rights over, showing their friends how lucky and dedicated they are to obtaining the creatures, and this incentive to engage with the games for longer periods of time than normal otherwise to find these special creatures, even if it's just for show, has allowed the feature to be a mainstay in the series ever since it debuted, and it is likely that shiny Pokémon will continue to be a fundamental feature of the franchise with little to impede their presence in the future.
With that, we now move past the era of the Game Boy and Game Boy Color and into a whole new world of hardware and the next part of the V.T.P. Thank you for watching this video. It brings me great joy to be able to speak to you all in the world each and every time we meet like this, to explore the many different facets of both the world of Pokemon as we know it and the world as we live it through every adventure we have with Pokemon by our side. If you'd like to, please subscribe, ring the bell and all that jazz to keep yourself updated on content uploads and other materials of the like. You can also follow me on Twitter if you'd like to know right away when something new is uploaded, and my written works, from which most of this is based on, can be found on DeviantArt. Links to both can be found in the description down below. Remember that the world of Pokemon is a place full of wonder and mystery, and you never know what to expect. So, stay vigilant, keep watch, and always be prepared for the unexpected. Until next time, trainers and friends of all sorts, have a wonderful time.